Welcome to another deep dive. We're going to explore something so fundamental to life that we rarely stop to think about it.
That's often the case with the most important things, isn't it? Hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. And today we're talking about tissues, those building blocks that make up both plants and animals.
It's incredible to think about how these organized groups of cells create the complexity we see in nature.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, can we start with a simple definition? What exactly is a tissue?
A tissue is a collection of cells, similar in structure, that work together for a common function.
Okay, so it's not just a random clump of cells, it's about shared purpose.
Precisely. They're organized and they act in a coordinated way. It's like a team working towards a specific goal.
That makes sense. Can you give us some examples of tissues and what they do?
Sure, think about muscle tissue. It's made up of cells that can contract and relax. When these cells work together as a tissue, they generate the force needed for movement.
Ah, so like every time I lift something or even just walk around, it's muscle tissue making that possible.
Exactly. Or consider our skin.
Skin! Isn't that just a covering?
It's much more than that. Skin is a type of epithelial tissue. It forms a protective barrier against the outside world, keeping us safe from infection, injury, and regulating our temperature.
Wow, so tissues really are the foundation of how organisms function. Now, I'm curious about plant tissues. Do plants even have tissues, or is that just an animal thing?
Plants have tissues too, but their structure and function are often quite different from what we see in animals.
I bet that has something to do with their lifestyles. Plants are stationary, while animals are constantly moving.
You hit the nail on the head. Plants need a lot of structural support. Their tissues, especially in those woody parts like tree trunks, are often made of dead cells with thick walls. That gives them strength and rigidity.
Dead cells. That's so different from animal tissues.
It is. Animals need tissues that are more flexible and require more energy. For example, muscle tissue needs a constant supply of energy to power those contractions.
So it's like comparing the wood of a tree trunk to the muscles in a cheetah's leg. Both provide support and structure, but in very different ways.
Exactly. Another big difference is in how they grow. Plants have specific regions called meristems where cell division happens. These meristems allow for continuous growth throughout a plant's life.
That's amazing. So a plant can just keep growing taller and wider, unlike animals, which generally reach a certain size limit.
Right. That difference in growth reflects their fundamental differences in life cycles and roles in the ecosystem.
So it seems like there's a lot to unpack when it comes to tissues, both in plants and animals. We've touched upon some key differences, but let's delve deeper into the specific types of tissues in each kingdom, starting with plants. Right, let's dive into those plant tissues. I remember learning about these special areas in plants called meristems. They're like the growth centers, right?
You've got it. Meristematic tissue is all about growth. It's found in specific regions and keeps producing new cells, allowing the plant to grow taller, wider, and branch out.
I'm thinking back to that onion experiment from the research we did for this deep dive. Cutting the tip off the root stopped one of the onions from growing. I'm curious, why did that happen?
That experiment highlights how important meristems are. The root tip has a type of meristem called the apical meristem, which is key for the root growing longer. When they cut it off, they basically removed the root's ability to make new cells and grow deeper.
It's like they took away the engine for growth. So are there other types of meristems in plants?
Absolutely. Besides the apical meristems at the tips of roots and stems, there are lateral meristems. These increase the girth of the plant. Think about how a tree trunk gets wider over time.
That makes sense. And what about intercalary meristems? Where do those fit in?
Those are a bit more specialized. They're found near the nodes, those points where leaves or branches attach to the stem, and they help those specific areas elongate.
So we've got these meristems churning out new cells, but what happens to those new cells? Do they just stay as generic cells, or do they change and become specialized?
Great question. The new cells go through a process called differentiation. They develop specialized structures and functions, becoming the diverse cell types that form the various tissues of a plant. It's like they're choosing their career paths.
I love that analogy. It's like students graduating and specializing in their chosen fields. So tell me more about those specialized cells and the permanent tissues they form. What are some of the major types of plant tissues we should know?
Let's begin with the simplest type, parenchyma. Parenchyma cells are the most common, and they're super versatile, kind of like the generalists of the plant world.
Generalists. What does that mean in terms of plant cells?
They can do a lot. They store food, water, and even air. Some even contain chlorophyll and carry out photosynthesis. We call those chlorenchyma cells.
Ah, so some parenchyma cells are like the plant's chefs, cooking up food through photosynthesis.
Exactly. And if we look at aquatic plants, parenchyma cells can even develop large air cavities called parenchyma. This helps them stay buoyant in the water.
Wow, so they're multi-talented. Okay, so we've got parenchyma. What other simple tissues are there in plants?
There's collenchyma. These cells have thicker cell walls compared to parenchyma and give flexible support to the plant, especially in young growing areas.
So collenchyma is like a support system, helping a young plant stand tall and reach for the sunlight.
That's a great way to put it. Then we have the strong type, sclerenchyma. They're kind of the tough guys of plant tissues.
Now that you mention it, I do remember that sclerenchyma cells have super thick walls. What makes them so strong?
Their cell walls are reinforced with a substance called lignin, making them incredibly hard and rigid. They provide that structural support to mature plant parts.
So when I'm struggling to cut a celery stalk or crack open a coconut, it's those tough sclerenchyma cells giving me a workout.
You got it. And here's an interesting fact. Many sclerenchyma cells are actually dead at maturity, but those tough cell walls remain, giving the plant strength and protection.
It's like they sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the plant. Okay, so we've explored the simple plant tissues made of one cell type. Now, what about those complex tissues?
Complex tissues are made up of multiple cell types working together. The superstars here are the xylem and phloem.
Those names ring a bell. They're involved in transport within the plant, right? Like a circulatory system.
That's right. Xylem and phloem make up a network of vascular tissue that runs throughout the entire plant, connecting the roots, stems, and leaves.
So it's like a plant-wide highway system. Let's break this down. What does xylem do exactly?
Xylem is responsible for transporting water and dissolved minerals all the way from the roots up to the rest of the plant.
That sounds like a massive task. How do those xylem cells manage to move water against gravity, sometimes hundreds of feet up into the air?
It all comes down to their ingenious structure. Xylem is made up of different cell types, including tracheids and vessel elements, and these are actually dead at maturity, which is key for their function.
Dead cells. Wait, how can dead cells transport water?
That's the amazing part. When they die, they leave behind hollow tubes with those thick, lignified walls. These tubes connect end to end, creating these long pipelines that go from the roots to the leaves.
So it's like a series of interconnected pipes, allowing water to flow upwards without any obstacles.
Exactly. Because they're dead cells, there's no cytoplasm or organelles blocking the flow of water. It's a perfect example of how structure and function go hand in hand.
It's incredible how nature designs these things.
Yeah.
Okay, so xylem takes care of water transport. What about phloem? What's its cargo?
Phloem transports the sugars produced during photosynthesis, carrying them from the leaves to other parts of the plant that need energy and building blocks for growth.
So it's like the plant's food delivery service, making sure those precious sugars reach every part of the plant.
That's a great way to picture it. Phloem is also made up of multiple cell types. The most important are the sieve tube elements and their helpful sidekicks, the companion cells.
Sieve tube elements. Those sound interesting. Tell me more about them.
They're long, slender cells that connect end to end, forming those sugar highways. They have modified end walls with pores called sieve plates, which allow the sugars to flow from one cell to the next.
So it's like a pipeline with checkpoints along the way. But what about the companion cells? What role do they play?
Well, unlike the sieve tube elements, companion cells are alive and kicking. They provide energy and help regulate the transport process. It's a bit like a support team for the sieve tubes, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Even in the plant world, there's this theme of teamwork. It's fascinating.
It really is. This cooperation between different cell types in xylem and phloem is what allows for efficient transport of water and sugars throughout the plant, ensuring its growth and survival.
We've learned so much about plant tissues today, and I'm truly amazed by how specialized and intricate they are. Now, I'm ready to switch gears and dive into the world of animal tissues. Okay, let's explore those animal tissues. When we think about animals, movement is such a defining characteristic.
Absolutely. And that movement is powered by, you guessed it, muscle tissue.
Right, it's what allows us to run, jump, swim, even just walk around.
Yeah.
What is it about muscle tissue that makes it so good at generating movement?
Muscle tissue is made up of cells that are specialized for contraction. These cells have protein filaments that can slide past each other. This action, the sliding, shortens the cell, and that generates force.
Fascinating. It's those tiny interactions at the cellular level that let us move our bodies.
That's right. And there are actually 3 different types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Each has a unique structure and function.
Okay, let's break those down. I'm pretty familiar with skeletal muscle. I think that's what we're using when we exercise, right?
Exactly. Skeletal muscle is what we usually think of as muscles. It's attached to bones by tendons, and when it contracts, it pulls on those bones, creating movement.
And we have conscious control over skeletal muscle, right? We can decide to move it.
That's right, it's voluntary. Now, smooth muscle is a bit different. It's found in the walls of our internal organs, like the stomach, intestines, blood vessels.
Ah, so smooth muscle is responsible for all those movements we don't have to think about, like digestion and keeping our blood flowing.
Precisely. It controls those involuntary actions that keep our body running behind the scenes. And unlike skeletal muscle, smooth muscle doesn't have those stripes, those striations, when you look at it under a microscope. It appears, well, smoother.
Okay, and then there's cardiac muscle, the muscle of the heart.
Ah, yes. Cardiac muscle is truly remarkable. It's what allows our hearts to beat constantly, pumping blood throughout our bodies.
It's amazing how our heart just keeps going and going. What makes cardiac muscle different from the others?
Cardiac muscle cells are branched and they're interconnected. This allows them to communicate and contract in this wave-like pattern, making sure the heart pumps efficiently.
So it's like a coordinated team of cells keeping that rhythm going. Okay, so we've got those muscles powering movement, but we also need tissues that connect and support different parts of our bodies.
You're thinking of connective tissues,
Yeah.
and they're incredibly diverse, coming in all sorts of forms, each with a special role to play.
Let's start with one I know, blood. It's vital for transporting oxygen and nutrients. I never really thought of it as a tissue, though.
Blood is a great example of fluid connective tissue. It's
Wow.
made up of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, all those important components, and they're all suspended in a liquid matrix called plasma.
It's like a busy highway, all those different cells traveling along, doing their jobs. What about bone? That's definitely a connective tissue.
Absolutely. Bone gives us that rigid framework that's support protecting our organs. It gets its strength from a hard matrix secreted by bone cells. Those are called osteocytes. This matrix is mostly calcium and phosphorus compounds.
What about cartilage? It's not as hard as bone, right? It's in our joints, and it seems more flexible.
You're right, cartilage is also connective tissue, but it's more flexible than bone. It has cells called chondrocytes that produce a matrix rich in collagen and elastin fibers. Those give it that springiness.
It's like a natural shock absorber for our joints. So we've got blood, bone, cartilage. What else falls under the umbrella of connective tissue?
Well, there are tendons connecting our muscles to bones and ligaments connecting bones to other bones. Both have to be tough, able to withstand the forces of movement. Then there's areolar tissue. It's a loose connective tissue that's basically everywhere, filling spaces, supporting organs, blood vessels, nerves.
So areolar tissue is like the packing material of our body, holding everything together. And finally, there's adipose tissue, right? That's where we store fat.
Right. Adipose tissue acts as an energy reserve and also helps with insulation and cushioning. So we've talked about muscles, the movers, and connective tissues, the connectors. Now let's move on to another essential type, epithelial tissue.
Epithelial tissue, what's that all about?
Epithelial tissue forms those protective layers and linings throughout our bodies. You can think of it as covering our surfaces, both inside and out.
So like our skin on the outside and the lining of our organs on the inside.
That's it. It also forms boundaries between different compartments within our bodies. And just like connective tissues, epithelial tissues come in many forms, with different shapes and arrangements depending on their job.
Can you give me some examples of those different types of epithelial tissues?
Sure. Let's start with simple squamous epithelium. These cells are thin and flat, forming delicate linings in places like blood vessels and those tiny air sacs in our lungs. They're perfect for areas where diffusion is important.
So it's like a thin, breathable layer that allows for easy exchange of substances.
Exactly. Then there's stratified squamous epithelium, which is multiple layers of cells piled on top of each other.
Like a multi-layered shield.
Yeah.
Where would we find this type of epithelial tissue?
In areas that experience wear and tear, like our skin, the lining of our mouths, the esophagus, those multiple layers provide that extra protection against damage.
Makes sense. Are there any other types we should know?
We also have columnar epithelium. These are taller cells shaped like columns. They often have tiny hair-like projections on their surface called cilia.
Cilia. What do those do?
Cilia move in a coordinated way, like little oars, and help sweep substances along the surface. They're found in our respiratory tract, helping to move mucus and debris out of our lungs.
It's like a built-in cleaning system.
Wow. So we've got all these different types of epithelial tissue, each specialized for its location and function. What's the last type of animal tissue we need to cover?
We can't forget nervous tissue. This is the communicator of the body. It's what makes up our brains and spinal cords.
Nervous tissue is responsible for sending those signals that let us control our movements and basically everything else our bodies do.
That's right. The stars of nervous tissue are the neurons. These cells can receive, process, and transmit information as electrical signals. That's how different parts of the body communicate with each other.
So neurons are like the wiring of our bodies, carrying messages all over the place.
Exactly. This amazing communication network is what allows us to sense the world, control our movements, think, feel, everything that makes us who we are. So to wrap up this incredible journey, we've learned that tissues are the building blocks of both plants and animals. In plants, we've got those growth-driving meristems, and then the specialized tissues like parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma, providing different types of support. We also saw how xylem and phloem work together to transport water and nutrients throughout the plant. Then, in animals, we dove into the world of muscle tissue, the powerhouse of movement, and the diverse types of connective tissue that hold everything together. We explored epithelial tissue, forming protective barriers and linings, and finally, the fascinating nervous tissue, responsible for communication and making us who we are. It's mind-blowing how these organized groups of cells work together to create the complexity and beauty of life.
It really is. Tissues are a testament to the power of cooperation and specialization at the cellular level.
Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into the world of tissues. It's given me a whole new appreciation for the hidden wonders that make life possible.